Heathenry is a worldview, not a faith. I mentioned in my faith video that I dislike that term. In part, any religion requires suspension of disbelief in order to follow it. So, the term faith isn't inaccurate so much as it paints an incorrect picture, especially to the newbie or uninitiated. A worldview is exactly how it sounds. In heathenry, we view the world differently than other paths. There are certain principles inherent to heathenry that shape our understanding. That being said, one should not adopt something into their personal worldview just because it's part of the prescribed lexicon. Decide for yourself and examine what is and why it is or isn't important. Remember my 3 steps of integrating beliefs. 1. Historical sources. What do they say about it? 2. Modern perceptions. How is it seen today? And 3. Most importantly, is it applicable to your path? Remember, it's a path because it's a journey. More importantly, it's your journey. You will grow, adapt, and change based on what you believe you need. Don't just believe or do something because everyone else does. Now, a few terms to clarify what I mean. First, worship. In heathenry, worship isn't the same as the prostrating martyr worshippers. We recognize the worth of gods, spirits, and ancestors. The original etymology of worship means to give worth. Some heathens do prostrate, but it seems to be a Christian influence, as gods are not the center of the general heathen worldview. We tend to think in those terms because of the dominant Abrahamic overculture, but it's not the case from arch-heathen sources. No, heathens typically go local before macro. Prayer, which I'll go over, is more invocative than begging. And we tend towards ancestors, Vaettir and Alfar, before gods. Ancestor veneration. Ancestors are pretty self-explanatory. Those who paved the way for your existence. Typically this means the family line, though not necessarily bloodline. Family isn't always blood. Close friends or anyone who helped raise you can easily be regarded as family. For me, I have a grandfather who passed a couple of years ago. I was closer to him than my biological grandfather, and I definitely consider him an ancestor. Often in my childhood, he was a father figure. Yet we have no blood relation, and I honor him in blood. Disir are another heathen concept regarding ancestors. Female ancestors who've passed and stayed back to protect their descendants. I've talked a bit about them in other videos. We honor them with Dísablót, a holiday sometime in the fall, though the exact date is disputed. Of course, the Norse calendar was nothing like the Gregorian calendar given to us by the Roman Catholics, but I typically do Dísablót the night before solstice, or Mother's Night. Vaettir. Vaettir means spirit, roughly. This can be spirits of hearth and home, or land spirits. The heathen worldview was an animist one. Animism is the belief that everything has a soul, or reflection in the spiritual realm. We can see this in the dwarves. The lore usually names them for objects. I'll be giving them their own video, as there's some interesting archetypal analysis to share. We often see the Anglo-Saxon white used instead, for some reason. I prefer the Old Norse Vaettir, since it doesn't sound like an already existing English word, plus it's more accurate to the arch-heathen lexicon. The House Vaettir are where legends like brownies and goblins come from, the latter vilified by a Christian overculture and often become antagonists in the fantasy genre. Many heathens honor House Vaettir with gifts, or a fairy home. In fact, one Yule tradition is to make a small home for your House Vaettir. The land Vaettir are exactly what they sound like, spirits of the land. At the end of every blót, I offer a portion of every bit of food we shared that night, along with the last portion of mead and the horn. I think it's very important to give worth to the Vaettir, especially of the land. We often take our environments for granted, and this is a good reminder not to. Alfar are akin to the Gaelic fairfolk, or fairies. They play tricks, live in certain areas untouched or abandoned by humanity, and have very similar stories. Alfar come in a few variations, and like many things in the heathen worldview, don't necessarily have a hardline definition. If you'll recall from my Alpha Blót video, they're also associated with the burial mound, and it's plausible that the revered dead can become Alfar. Völundr, a god of smithing, is known to be an Ulf in some accounts. He's also called Wayland the Smith. This leads some credibility to the euhemeristic idea that people can ascend to godhood, something Bragi, god of poetry, was also said to have done.
Fucking god of rock!
But with Völundr gaining Alfar status, we see blurred lines between Ulf, ancestor, and deity. Alfar are elves, that's where the word elf originates, and they're probably not small furry aliens with a taste for felines. Interestingly, dwarves, or dvergr, may be interchangeable with dark Alfar, but again, we'll explore that more when we do a dwarves video. Even today, Scandinavian peoples tend to avoid building in areas where Alfar are said to live, a folk belief that they, much like the fair folk, will react in kind to the disturbance of their home. This leads me to believe that they may be associated, if not synonymous, with the land Vaettir. In practical terms, it reminds us to keep places untouched. Again, we should revere nature rather than try to control it and suck it of its resources. Beyond those more external forces, intrinsically, we have different spiritual parts of us. Many pagan traditions believe the soul has parts, and beyond that, we have principles ascribed to us by certain powers that be. I already went over a couple, but here are a few brief descriptions. I should caveat that Edred Thorson, aka Stephen Flowers, proposed 9 parts of the soul. Certain things like the Lich were him just trying to get to that sweet sacred number 9, a reflection of his ceremonial magic background being imposed into his heathenry. One ritual my kindred does, based on historical accounts, is the name day. 9 days after a child is born, they get a name. A sign that the child is both accepted by the kindred and has gained more of their soul parts. In arch-heathen times, it was also a sign a child would live. Thankfully, modern standards of living have increased survival for newborns. I'll be doing a dedicated video on the rite we do as well. So many videos, so little time. Hamr. Hamr roughly means shape or skin. Ulfithnar and other shifters were called Hamramr, meaning shape changer. This is one reason why terms like Lich are redundant, and dude was really trying to get to that sacred 9. The arch-heathens understood your Hamr is a changeable thing through certain magics, leading us to further associate the Gungur, or Berserker Fury, with shamanic or magical practices, something later vilified by the church. You'll notice the medieval Christian werewolf lore that they always need a skin or belt made of skin. You'll also note that the Berserker and Ulfithnar both relate to the individual's skin. This comes from the earlier pagan practice of changing one's skin, or Hamr. Both the moon and silver have no actual historical basis. That's purely Hollywood. In fact, the director of the original Universal Studios Wolfman admitted making it up. Yet, it's now a staple of modern media. I can rant further and probably will do so in a separate video, but you get the gist. So obviously you're born into your Hamr. Hugr. Hugr means mind. You'll notice a similarity to Hugin, one of Odin's ravens. The ravens Hugin, meaning thought, and Munin, meaning memory, are probably part of Odin's soul, similar to how Sleipnir may be akin to Windhorse, a principle in the Tengurist religion that allows the shaman to travel the world tree. I've mentioned this before in a few videos. Your Hugr develops as you grow. This is your inner self, the part of you that is your personality and self-identity. We'll go over the mind in the heathen worldview more when I do a video on Mani, the moon god, as the moon represents the human mind. Hugr is more closely related to the modern understanding of what a soul could be. Beyond that, we have parts of the self that are inherited in family lines. The first 2 we'll go over, the Fylgja and the Hamingja. These 2, along with the Dis, singular for Disir, mentioned earlier, may be something from an older matriarchal religion we know very little about. Again, they will get their own video, but they're known as the Matronae, or mothers. They probably influenced things like the Nornir and the various triple goddesses the Wiccans are fond of venerating. Though sometimes independent feminine characters like Lilith, Ingerbotha, or Medusa are vilified and conquered by the male ideal, simply because they go against the grain of what their respective societies deem good and bad. Again, I'll elaborate in a separate video. The Fylgja. Fylgja, plural Fylgjur, means follower, but it's much more. It's essentially the animal totem of either a group or individual. The family Fylgja is called Ásatrúarfélagið, and the personal Fylgja is Mansfylgja. Man, etymologically, also refers to the mind, hence Mani, the moon god, representing the mind. It's not gendered, hence why we say mankind or human. The ancient understanding of what we are refers to our mind. Hell, even our scientific designation, Homo sapien, means wise man. We keep naming ourselves after the ability to think. Back to Fylgja. The Fylgja is both an animal guide and part of the self. Going back to the Ulfithnar, I believe they, like many shamanic warriors, are simply more in tune with their Fylgja. My Fylgja, I believe, is the wolf. I actually grew up with a wolf dog named Nikki. We were both 7 when she died. The wolf has always been around me in the back of my mind. I believe most of the monsters of mythology were embellished stories of actual people with certain traits and predilections. The Ulfithnar were connected to wolves, wore their hammer, and fought like them. The embellishment of those stories, coupled with fear of the shadow, especially by medieval Christians, and a negative connotation with wolves, led to werewolves being associated with devilry and sorcery. Werewolves were actually persecuted as witches in the Dark Ages, more evidence that it's a shamanic spiritual practice, not people actually turning into wolves. I'll go over the relationship to humanity and wolves and their vilification when I do Fenrir. Interestingly, on my son's name day, we heard the neighborhood dogs howling. The fylgja is said to be inherited on your name day. Hamingja. This one I already did a dedicated video on. Hamingja means luck, and again it's inherited. This is where the popular motto, "We are our deeds," becomes very important, because not only is Hamingja inherited, it's also earned. Our reputations and our actions decide our luck, and the reputations and deeds of your family affect your luck. Luck can be built or lost based on your actions. I use Shay Cormac in the thumbnail of the video because he constantly says, "I make my own luck," throughout Assassin's Creed Rogue. I thought it was a good analogy for Hamingja because it's not just some arbitrary force that is either positive or negative. You are in charge of whether or not you have bad luck. You forge the path ahead and you get what you put in. You may not be able to pick the hand you're dealt, but you decide what you do with that hand. You've got to know when to hold them. You've got to know when to fold them. Know when to walk away. Know when to run. You never count your money when you're sitting at the table. There'll be time enough for counting when the dealing's done. Orlaw. Orlaw is the Norse concept of fate. I went over some of the concepts behind this in my Viking Karma video. Essentially, Orlaw translates to primal layers, and again refers to the motto, "We are our deeds," but encompasses more. Fate, to the arch-heathens, was preordained, but that doesn't mean we can't decide how we react to those moments the Nornir bring before us. The Nornir are the three fates. Urð, commonly called Wyrd, which is the anglicized name, not the Old Norse, Verdandi, and Skald, past, present, and what should be. Note the three goddesses motif mentioned earlier. And if you're familiar with Shakespeare's Macbeth, you may recognize the Wyrd Sisters. Nornir are tied to the Volva, and probably Shakespeare's inspiration. Your actions feed the Well of Urð, and the Well of Urð feeds Yggdrassil, the World Tree. These primal layers are built on your actions. Your Orlaw is not just your fate, but who you've been in the past. Every action you've ever taken, every mistake, every triumph, every trauma, all of it, has led to the culmination of who you are today. We truly are our deeds. We must own who we are. That big event in your life you regret, that great mistake, even that has put you in the situation you're in now. And more importantly, the lessons we learn wouldn't exist without those mistakes. Skald isn't the future, she's what should be. You're destined for certain events and trials, but that doesn't mean the outcomes are ordained. You decide your actions. You decide how to feed the well. During Blot, we feed the well more symbolically, as the mead horn represents the well, and the words spoken are intended to feed Yggdrasil. The world tree connects us all, and feeds worth, remember worship means to give worth, to those we honor in Blot. Gifting cycle. This is one I think is most misunderstood. Many people attribute this to a quid pro quo with the gods. The arch-heathens had what is referred to as a gift economy. Many pre-Abrahamic societies had this cultural practice. Basically, the idea is that we build relationships through gift giving. Obviously, it's not the only way, but it's a substantial way. Giving someone something of value, especially something personal and meaningful, builds that bond between people. It can help build frith. This is one of the purposes of the arm rings. The arch-heathen Jarl class had to give to the people to stay in power. A common practice amongst both Celtic and Germanic rulers was to give to the people. Imagine taxes, but in reverse. This led to raids, like the Vikings are known for. There are some sources that state that arch-heathens gave gifts to get things in return, but I believe this was the Christian perspective and skew of the written sources, especially given they first went to the more localized spirits. Giving offerings to the gods isn't about a gift for a gift, it's giving in appreciation. We don't expect anything in return but gratitude. A relationship where you expect to get something every time you give something is selfish and frankly toxic. If they so choose to return the favor, so be it, but don't expect it. This is probably an influential origin to the presents given at Christmas. Frith. I did a video on Frith and letting people grow. The audio was terrible, and it was filmed in a bathroom at work, but I'll expand on it here. Frith means peace, but it also means community relations. It stresses the importance of building relationships with kith and kin. Building Frith means establishing relationships. Maybe give gifts and spend time together. Blot can be an excellent way to build Frith. As we pass the horn and hail the gods, ancestors, Vaettir, and even each other, or whatever we wish to show has value to us, we share something the kin may not have known. Tears and laughs are very common at the bloats I've held. Keeping Frith is exactly what it sounds like. Any relationship takes work. Then we have to show each other that we value one another, listen to one another, and don't try to control each other. Heathens tend to be very direct, but polite. We should help those in our inner yard and be grateful when we get help, but also don't be afraid to ask and open up. If you're not comfortable with your kindred, something is wrong. Grith. Grith is more for outer yard relationships. It essentially means abiding by the law or rules. For example, you don't consider work colleagues inner yard, but you still treat them with respect that society, ethics, and policy dictate. Grith was often observed at things, legal assemblies of the arch-heathens. As I was typing the script for this, the autocorrect kept making grith into girth. I think it would violate grith to give girth to your work colleagues. Inner yard and outer yard. Quite simply, your inner yard are those closest to you, and your outer yard is everyone else. This is mostly a modern definition for a theme seen in the lore and sagas. The word Utgard is in one tale, but beyond that, it isn't seen anywhere else. And Innengard is never in any Old Norse sources. However, it is natural for people to accept tribal identities and distinctions, as well as a fear of what lies beyond our safe fences. The Rokr, the darker gods of chaos, exist outside of the arch-heathen inner yard, and most of society regards such things as outer yard. That doesn't mean they're evil in the Abrahamic sense, they're simply forces outside the safe and known. Typically, your inner yard is your family and friends. For heathens, some of those people will be in your kindred. Kindred. The heathen group is called a kindred. Some heathens will call it something else, but most call it a kindred. Where groups of Wiccans will have a coven, mostly dedicated to a magical practice and eventually priesthood of sorts, heathens have a kindred, a familial group that doesn't just congregate where religious means, but also friendly ones. A healthy kindred will hang out and help each other out. Frith building shouldn't be a chore, and your kin should be people you trust and get along with. No two kindreds are identical. Everyone requires their own interpretation of the old ways. Nobody is necessarily doing it wrong, as everyone has different needs and perspectives. Even kin members may differ. I like to build a kindred based on quality of character more than shared beliefs. Finally, prayer. Firstly, we'll start with a quote from the man who coined the term Asatru, the founder of the Ásatrúarfélagið, the Asatru Fellowship of Iceland. Anyone can pray to the gods in whatever manner he likes. Sveinbjörn Benteinsson. That being said, I've seen some terrible arguments from people for heathen prayers, mostly filling in the gaps with Greco-Roman sources, though I think it's important to examine the archetypal threads, especially through Proto-Indo-European sired cultures. Rome is especially a bad source for heathen religious practices, at least as a direct source. Rome was an authoritarian state, and their religion was directly tied to the government. This is why Catholicism looks the way it does today, and did in medieval times. So while Greco-Roman sources can be good for ancillary sources, they're not definitive. We saw that in my tier video. Here's one popular example of a prayer in Yggdrassil. Hail to thee day, hail ye day's sons, hail night and daughter of night. With blithe eyes look on both of us, and grant those sitting here victory. Hail Aesir, hail Aesir, hail earth that givest to all. Goodly spells and speech beseek we from you, and healing hands in this life. Notice its format. Praise, often including deed names, followed by an ask and repeated. It's not begging like the Abrahamics, it's invocation. To clarify, to invoke is to draw something in. In this case, Dagr, the Norse personification of Day, and his sons, followed by the Aesir and Aesir, the latter being the female, though most just say Aesir for all genders in the main family of gods today. Here's another popular example from the second of the Mersburg charms. Thor and Woden were riding in the woods, and the foot of Baldur's fowl was sprained. So Sithgnut, Sunna's sister, conjured it, and Freya, Vola's sister, conjured it, and Woden conjured it. And well he could, like bone sprain, so blood sprain, so joint sprain, bone to bone, blood to blood, joints to joints, so may they be glued. Again, we see more magical incantation than prostration, though one could argue Christians don't realize they're invoking their God, but don't tell them that. To be honest, prayer never made much sense to me. If the gods are off doing God stuff, why would they listen to one mortal? Some heathens believe they need to take particular interest in you. But if you look at the sagas, that interest isn't always good. Odin, for example, is notorious for setting things into motion because he needs warriors of a certain caliber for Valhall. Good if you want to dedicate your afterlife to fighting, but often they meet a short, violent end. It makes more sense to me that the gods and ancestors would value your actions more than your words. I feel that's more in line with the rest of heathenry. Bloat is where I speak honey-liquored words and thank them for the gifts I have. Gifts I hope I use well and will use better as I learn and grow. That's a pretty decent list to get you started on understanding the heathen worldview. It should also be noted that polytheism in general is pluralistic. Loki would solve something different than Thor. Thor would probably be far more direct than Loki. Odin would typically be more tactful, but not as direct as Thor, and Bragi would probably write a song about it. None are incorrect in their way of achieving a goal, simply different in approach. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with diverging from the heathen worldview. You'll find trends in heathens, but there's no right or wrong way, simply your way.
This is the way.
This is the way. This is the way.
The only thing I'd say you can do incorrectly, other than gatekeeping outside of entry into your own kindred, is stagnation. We should always be striving towards more understanding, more sources, and more importantly, building more traditions in the modern era. Whereas paths like Wicca rely on intuition, heathenry relies on interpretation. It's up to you to decide how your heathenry looks. Nobody else could or should dictate your path. Remember, diversity of thought and polyaletheic understanding are the core of polytheism. Be better tomorrow than you were yesterday. We are the sum of our actions. Skull!